I came face to face with a problem that I think all of us deal with. And it's that we have a really hard time committing to things. We live in a day when it's very normal to hop from relationship to relationship and from job to job and even from church to church. And I think that the reason why we have such a hard time committing is because underneath the surface of all of our lives, we have these basic fears that are operating. Now, fear is not a bad thing. We were made to fear God, but misplaced fears will control us. Think about some of these fears. Deep down, we wonder, what if I am let down? What if the mistakes I've made in the past all of a sudden become an issue? What if I am led down the wrong path? What if I am not fulfilled? And I think the fear that probably drives our generation more than any is, what if I find something better down the road? But see, being non-committal is actually a commitment in and of itself. Our inability to commit just proves our deep commitment to ourselves. Today we're going to be in Psalm 25. If you have your Bible, you can open up there. As Psalm 25 begins, David uses this phrase, he borrows it from Psalm 24 to describe his commitment to God. He says, "To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul." So to lift up one's soul is just another way to say, I worship you. But as we learned last week, worship is more than what we do on Sunday. But worship is also more than just learning to sing Christian songs from Monday to Saturday. Worship is choosing to give ourselves over to something, hoping that that thing will give us life, meaning, and happiness. So our souls were made to rest securely in God's hands, but the essence of sin is this, that we choose to entrust our souls into our own hands rather than in His. So think about that concept in the context of some of those fears we just talked about. The fear of, what if I am let down? We think, well, I am the most qualified to hold myself up. What about the fear of, what if the mistakes in my past all of a sudden become an issue? We think, I'm the only person who can really handle my shame. What if I'm led down the wrong path? We say, I will create my own path. What if I am not fulfilled? We think, well, surely I will look out for my own happiness better than anyone else can. And that last and final fear, what if I find something better down the road? We think, I'll always hold something a little bit back so that I'm in control, so that if I need to make a change or a transition, I can do that easily. All of us here today are sinners, which means that in some large measure of our lives, we have been attempting to solve our own problems with our own solutions. But I think that you are here today because you want to change. I think that you got in your car and drove to church today to find a better option. And St. Augustine says it this way, or said it this way. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee. The goal of Psalm 25 is simple: to convince us that if we commit ourselves completely to God, that we won't regret it in the end. If we go 100% commitment to Him, He will satisfy our deepest longings. So let's read Psalm 25 together. Psalm 25, a psalm of David. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Do not let me be ashamed. Do not let my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none of those who wait for you will be ashamed. Those who deal treacherously without cause will be ashamed. Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and your loving kindnesses, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your loving kindness, remember me for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in justice, and he teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are loving kindness and truth to those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord? He will instruct him in the way he should choose. His soul will abide in prosperity, and his descendants will inherit the land. The secret of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he will make them know his covenant. My eyes are continually toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Look upon my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Look upon my enemies, for they are many, and they hate me with a violent hatred. Guard my soul and deliver me. Do not let me be ashamed, for I take refuge in you. Let integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. This is the word of the Lord. So, my goal this morning is to look at 5 rock-solid reasons that we should lift up our soul to God. I think this passage is trying to convince us that we can totally and fully trust him. So first of all, we lift our soul to God because he is faithful. We see it first in verses 2 and 3. He says, "Oh my God, in you I trust. Do not let me be ashamed. Do not let my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none of those who wait for you will be ashamed. Those who deal treacherously without cause will be ashamed." So we get a sense that as David is lifting up his soul to God, he knows that there is risk involved. He says, "Do not let me be ashamed." He knows how ridiculous it might seem to simply trust. I mean, think about it. What would it say about David if he waited for God and God never showed up? But he reassures himself. He says it's impossible, knowing the character of God, to be left hanging by him. I'm sure by now you've seen people walking around with these interesting looking strap sandals called chacos. I'm not sure if anyone in the room is bold enough to wear them. Sorry. I own a pair. If you own them, you know they're great. One of the selling points of the Chaco is that it comes with a lifetime warranty. And, just like other warranties, they have their guidelines that you have to meet the requirement. But I am convinced that the Chaco company doesn't have just a gimmick for their lifetime warranty. And the reason why I'm convinced is because I actually watched one of my friends put his old broken sandals into a box and ship them off to an address that was posted on the website. And about 3 weeks later, the box arrived in the mail with a brand new pair of sandals. And, that's pretty awesome. This company has a reputation for following through on their warranty. So that if you or I put our sandals in the box and shipped them off, and we sat on our couch and waited and waited and waited, eventually that box would show back up with a brand new pair of sandals. What David is saying is he's saying, I've seen God's faithfulness. I've proved God's faithfulness again and again and again. God has a reputation for being faithful. And so, even though what I'm trusting in him maybe doesn't make sense, while I trust God, I am going to trust that he is trustworthy. I'm going to wait for him. Now we find out in the next two verses what it is that David is waiting on. He says, make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day. David is seeking guidance. He wants to make his life decisions in line with God's heart. He wants to do what God wants him to do, but he's left waiting. And rather than running ahead and trying to make something work for himself, he trusts the God of his salvation. He trusts that God is faithful. To wait means not to scheme, not to gossip, not to wallow in self-pity, not to sample other things. For David, waiting simply meant casting himself down until God showed up. Now, we get lots of pictures in the Bible of different people who have to wait. One of the most tragic stories is that of Abraham and Sarah. They're getting older in age, they don't have any children, and God comes to them and promises them a son. I mean, this is a wonderful, precious promise. But days turn to weeks, and weeks turn to months, and months turn to years. And after a while, they get tired of waiting. One of the saddest things happens. Sarah gives her servant girl to Abraham, and they have a child together. And for the rest of the Bible and the rest of history, there is conflict because they weren't willing to wait on the promises of God. See, we have to wonder what was going on in that moment. You know, what was going on in their minds and in their hearts that caused them to supersede waiting on God and try to make something happen on their own? Well, I think what we talked about earlier is what was happening. Instead of entrusting their soul to God, they were taking results into their own hands. They were taking their happiness into their own hands. They wanted what God had promised, but they weren't willing to wait on God's timing. Now, the encouraging part of this story is that even though they sinned, God was still faithful. He still gave them the promised son that he told them he was going to give them. See, God's faithfulness is not dependent upon ours. Paul says this, he writes this to Timothy in 2 Timothy. He says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. If God makes a promise, he always fulfills it. So, what does lifting up our soul to a faithful God mean for us? It means learning to wait. Sometimes we're just like David and we're seeking guidance. We have a big decision to make and we just aren't sure which way to go. And going with our gut, that's not waiting on God. The way that we worship God through the waiting is choosing not to just do the normal thing that any normal American would do anyways. What worshiping God through the waiting means is lifting up our soul to him and seeking him fervently in prayer. Other times, we are waiting for justice. We've been wronged and we want vengeance. But God has commanded us to leave vengeance to him. So when we run ahead and we try to make the wrongs right ourselves, what we're actually doing is we're taking our soul into our own hands. We're telling God that we trust ourselves with justice more than we trust him with justice. And I know for a fact that some of us here today are waiting for relationships. You're probably tempted to maybe date someone who's not a believer or be in a relationship with someone who's not pursuing Jesus like you are. And here we are again, being challenged to wait, being challenged to trust that the God of our salvation is faithful. Waiting is how we worship a God who is faithful. Secondly, we lift our soul to God because he is gracious. Look in verses 6 and 7. Remember, O Lord, your compassion and your loving kindnesses, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your loving kindness, remember me for your goodness' sake, O Lord. So if one fear for David in trusting God was that God might leave him hanging, another fear is that God might dig up the sins in his past and make David pay. What if David offered his soul up to God and what God found was a guilty soul? What if David trusted God with his sin only to find out that God was actually still angry with him for the things he has done? Why is it that David can offer up his guilty soul and the regrets from his past and trust that God won't destroy him? Well, we see the answer in verse 6. Your compassion and your loving kindnesses have been from of old. See, David's relationship with God is founded on something deeper than even David's own choices. If God's initial love for David had been based on something that David had done, then yes, David could have done something to make God stop loving him. But if God's love for David was an ancient, a sovereign love, then even David's biggest mistakes would not change God's mind about him. This is the key. God chose to love David, not because David was lovely, but because God is love. I'm sure that many of you here this morning have regrets from your past. You could point back to sins of your youth. Actually, one of my biggest hesitations in moving back here to pastor is the sins of my youth. Just this morning, someone came in who taught me when I was in school and remembered rebuking me for something that I had done. We were laughing about that. But many of you have seen me grow up. I've hurt some of you. I have been rebellious and prideful and impure and all sorts of other sins, and that is my youth, and it's been before many of your eyes. A few months ago, when Benjamin was born, we had a sort of a rough week. The first 8 to 10 days or so were pretty hard, and there was excitement for sure. But I couldn't help but think, maybe God is punishing me for sins I've committed. Maybe God has gone back into my past and dug up some of my failures, and he's finally coming to make me pay for what I've done. If you have thoughts like that, I just want to encourage you. So does one of your pastors. If you are tempted to believe that God might go back into your past and dig up the sins of your youth, I just want to encourage you with the same good news that washed over me, that God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. That he has cast our sin into the depths of the sea, and he has removed it from us as far as the east is from the west. We serve a gracious God. So what does lifting up our soul to a gracious God mean for us? It means learning to be honest. It means believing that no matter how deep our sin goes, God's love goes deeper. Confessing is how we worship a God who is gracious. Third, we lift our soul to God because he is good. Verses 8 through 11 make that clear. David says, "Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in justice, and he teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are loving kindness and truth to those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, for it is great." So who is this God that David is choosing to trust? What makes him trustworthy? Not only is he faithful and gracious, but he is good and righteous. God offers himself as a tutor, as a teacher, as a leader for us. Now, surely God would show his goodness to good people. But herein is the goodness of God, that he offers himself as a leader and a teacher and a guide to sinners. Now, David must admit that his own path, his own way, his own definitions of justice, they just won't cut it. The only prerequisite to experiencing God's good leadership is humility. For us to enjoy God as we follow him, we must acknowledge that we need him. Lately, one of the shows that Allie and I have been watching is MasterChef with Gordon Ramsay. It's really cool to see how the different home cooks, just kind of develop through the different episodes. But I love how every once in a while, Gordon Ramsay will actually cook a meal in front of them, like right in front of their face. And you can just see, like, they're just amazed because he's just so good at, what he's doing. And then every once in a while, one of these home cooks will be, cooking their meal, and Gordon will come up in his kind of not so subtle way, and he'll be like, what are you doing? Like, what's happening here? And they'll start to explain their dish to him. And he will say, no, you need to change that. Like, this is not going to work. This is not going to happen. And it's like almost every time they just keep doing it anyways. They think that they know how to cook better than Gordon Ramsay cooks. And they fail to realize that he is about to be the one to judge their food. And so they're just like doing it their way anyways. And Allie and I are like, what is happening? But it hit me. I treat God that way all the time. That he has humbled himself enough to come down and lead me, but I am not humble enough to follow him. So what does lifting up our soul to a good God mean? It means learning to follow. Now, many times, following means obeying. When we disobey God, we show clearly that we do not think he is good, that we do not think his commands are the best way to live. But when we do obey God, we prove that we do think he's good, that we do think his commands are the best way to live. But remember, the key in all of this is humility, because only humble people can obey when they are commanded. Other times, following God just flat out doesn't make sense. That it seems to be in opposition of everything else the world is telling us and what everyone in our life is telling us. And so, once we acknowledge that we are the student and he is the master, we have to be willing to throw out our sensibility even as an excuse to trust God. Again, think about this. Think about this in the life situations that you experience. Only humble people will agree to a strategy that they were not privy to making the plans of. And still, other times, following God means walking dead towards personal sacrifice. If, like the passage says, the paths of the Lord are loving kindness and truth, then following God will mean laying down our lives for other people. And you know this as well as I. Only humble people can truly and genuinely offer themselves up for the sake of another person. So following is how we worship a God who is good. Now, maybe you're thinking, I want to follow God, but I know that I'm proud. How do I grow in humility? How do I take steps towards humility? And I think that's probably one of the hardest questions to answer, because humility is not really so much something that you can go out and get, It's not really something that you can do. Humility kind of has to happen to you. It kind of has to fall on you. But I think if we think about it in some of those categories we just discussed, I think it can help us make sense of this. For example, when it comes to obedience and commands, I think that we grow in humility once we've disobeyed enough times that we realize that our way just doesn't work. I think another way that we grow in humility is that, thinking about sensibility, like common sense, making the right choice. I know you guys know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you do everything right. You make all the right choices, and it still doesn't turn out the way you thought it would. That life still throws you a curveball. And I think that God I think he does that sometimes to frustrate us. Because we think, no, I'm going to do it this way, and I'm going to do it the right way, and then it doesn't pan out the way we thought. And he's teaching us, hey, even when I ask you to do something that doesn't make sense, trust me, walk with me, follow me. And then I think probably the most important way that we garner humility is through experiencing some measure of brokenness. That the only way I could get to the place where I would actually lay down my life for someone else and sacrifice something willingly for someone else is if at some point in my life, God has taken something from me that I loved dearly and taught me to find my joy in him rather than in that thing. So if you want to follow God, this good God, it will be hard, and it will take walking through lessons in humility. But I think that what we'll find is that his goodness will shine through, and we'll be glad that he's making less of us and more of him. I think that's what we'll find. And I know I'm still on that journey. Fourthly, we lift our soul to God because he is great. Because he is great. Verses 12 through 15. Who is the man who fears the Lord? He will instruct him in the way he should choose. His soul will abide in prosperity, and his descendants will inherit the land. The secret of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he will make them know his covenant. My eyes are continually toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. So David is offering up his soul to God. He wants to follow God, and in the midst of it, he comes to grips with this truth, that what we fear is what we trust. And it is in fearing God that real life, actually starts to make sense. That if we want wisdom and knowledge, we can't actually get those things by seeking them. That the way we get wisdom and knowledge is by keeping our focus on God. I recently played golf, and I was reminded of the importance of our eyes. It seems so obvious to me that the way to hit a golf ball is by looking at the golf ball. But for some reason, I just had this habit of wanting to look up and see where the ball is going. And the problem is, if you look up before you hit the ball, if you look up where it's going before you hit the ball, then one of a couple of things either happens. You either dribble the ball forward, many times like I did last Saturday, is you hit the ball in the water, or sometimes you just completely miss the ball altogether because you're trying to set your eyes on the thing rather than the ball. So does that make sense? Okay. So I think that happens to us with God all the time. We think that the way that we can learn to navigate life and figure out life's confusion is by focusing on life itself. But here, what David is telling us is the person who will understand life and figure out life is actually the person who learns to fear God, who learns to set their eyes and their gaze on God, who takes their cue from Him. So what does lifting our soul to a great God mean? It means learning to fear. When we are making life choices, the best thing to do is to focus less on the choice and more on the God who is sovereign over the choice. I'm sure all of us can think of a time when we've made some poor choice. We made some decision that we knew wasn't the right thing because we feared some person more than we feared God. And because we're a slave to that person's approval, and because we have tied our life and meaning and happiness in that person's opinion, we actually end up making the choice that we know is not the right one. Psalm 25 is telling us that if we want prosperity, if we want the promised land, if we want that ultimate fulfillment that we desperately long for, it's not actually found in seeking those things in and of themselves. That if we sell out to our pleasures, we actually won't find them. But if we fear God and if we set our eyes on Him, He will fulfill our deepest longings. So fearing is how we worship a God who is great. Fifth and finally, we lift our soul to God because He is God. Look at verses 16 through 19. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Look upon my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Look upon my enemies, for they are many, and they hate me with a violent hatred. All of David's possible troubles come crashing down on him in one moment. All the barriers that we face in trusting God appear at the same time in David's life. The feeling of God's distance, the reality of his guilt, his loneliness of being by himself, the depression and anxiety of his heart, the people in his life who hate him and who want to do violence to him, all of that comes crashing down in one moment. I'm sure that you can remember a day or a season of life when it just kind of seemed like everything was going wrong. Why is it that houses and cars and phones just happen to break at the same time? Why is it that when we're in the deepest suffering, the people that we usually count on the most are nowhere to be found? Why is it that loneliness and guilt and depression sort of come as a package deal? And after all this, we're left wondering, will David abandon his trust in God? When all this trouble kind of comes crashing down on him, will this be the excuse he needed to take matters into his hands and do life his way? Let's look at it in verse 20 and 21. This is how David responds. He says, "Guard my soul and deliver me. Do not let me be ashamed, for I take refuge in you. Let integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you." With one last cry, David spews out his heart before God. He totally and utterly casts himself down. David knows that when trouble comes, that's not the time to abandon God. When trouble comes, that's the time to double down and go all in with God. After all, God is God, which means He is the only one qualified and able to handle the avalanche of troubles that finds all of us in this life. So what does learning to lift our soul to the only God mean? It means learning to trust Him with every single area of our lives. This is the vision of our church, to know Jesus and make all of life about Him. And that all of life includes all of the many and never-ending troubles that come our way. I think that we see in David how to trust God as God. Look at it. He says, he points us to this, that we trust God when he feels distant because God teaches us things in those dry seasons. He trusts God when he sins because he knows that God can truly forgive. He trusts God when he's lonely because God is his ultimate father and friend. He trusts God in the depression, knowing that while sorrow may last through the night, joy is promised in the morning. He trusts God in his afflictions, knowing that God uses every single thing in our lives for our good. So trust is how we worship a God who is truly God. Now, through David's troubles and sin and affliction and depression and loneliness and his enemies, he is drawn in verse 22 to look upward to the waiting and the longing of Israel's salvation. He ends this prayer saying, "Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles." In David's heart of hearts, he knows that all of these different problems he's feeling really all point to one thing that he needs, and one thing that we all need, and that is redemption. See, you might be thinking, how can I trust Psalm 25? Like, how can I trust that this isn't just one person's opinion? How can I trust that this God who you've been talking about is actually truly what you've told me he is? Well, throughout the Old Testament, people waited. Adam and Eve waited, and Abraham waited, and Moses waited, and Ruth waited, Isaiah waited, and Daniel waited, and Malachi waited, and really all of them were saying the same thing. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all of his troubles. And then there was silence. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might become children of God. And because you are sons, God has sent forth his Spirit into our hearts, crying, "Abba, Father." Do you want proof that God is faithful? After thousands of years of waiting, he sent his Son who he had promised. Do you want proof that God is gracious? Though our sins are like scarlet, he has washed them white as snow. He gave us Jesus to take the penalty that we deserved so that we could have a relationship with him. Do you want proof that God is good? He actually gives us his very Spirit to be an intimate leader and guide in our lives. Do you want proof that God is great? This Jesus whom he sent, he actually died. He actually stopped breathing. And then God raised him from the dead. And do you want proof that God is God? The eternal Word, the eternal Son of God, took on flesh and dwelt among us. He lived like one of us, yet without sin. Psalm 25 leaves us waiting. Verse 22 drops this clue for us that though our problems are many, too many to count, there is one solution, and his name is Jesus Christ. That these troubles, these many different types of troubles that we experience in this life are all pointing us to one place, to our Redeemer, Jesus. So sometimes lifting up our soul to God means waiting. And sometimes lifting up our soul to God means confessing. And sometimes lifting up our soul to God means following. Sometimes lifting up our soul to God means fearing. And sometimes lifting up our soul to God means trusting him with every single area of my life, including the chaos and the trouble. And while different seasons of life call for different responses, God never changes. And this we can be sure of, that because Jesus Christ broke into the world and lived and died and rose from the dead, we can be 100% certain that God is faithful, God is gracious, God is good, God is great, and he is God. And if we will commit ourselves completely to him, we won't regret it.